Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is James O. Freedman, who is the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. From 1987 to 2000, he was president of Dartmouth College, and from 1982 to 1987, the president of the University of Iowa. His publications include Crisis and Legitimacy, The Administrative Process, and American Government, and Idealism and Liberal Education. Mr. Freedman, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
You write in your book, Idealism and Liberal Education, which I will show here, you say, sometimes lives do seem to be framed by a theme, and you pose as an important question to identify the forces that created and shaped that defining theme. So I think it's fair for me to first ask you, what has been the defining theme of your life?
Well, that's a good question. You know, I think back to when I was probably in high school, and one of the books we were asked to read was Macaulay's essay on Johnson, a short essay, and we were told to go home one night and to find the sentence in that essay that best capsulized the theme of Samuel Johnson's life. And I have always remembered that sentence because Macaulay's sentence that is the pivot is, but the force of his mind overcame all impediments. So when I look at lives, including my own, I do try to think about what the themes were. I think in my life, there have really been two themes. The first has been the question of education. I fell in love with education as a young person. I loved to read. I loved to go to school. I didn't want to leave college. I didn't want to leave law school. That's certainly one of the themes. And I think the other theme has to do with whatever influences there were on me in growing up in a Jewish home in a small New Hampshire town with a very small Jewish population. And there's, of course, a very common, really mundane theme of Jewish kids striving to make their place in American society.
And how did your parents shape you in this regard?
Well, I think my father was a high school teacher. He taught junior year in high school. I think they shaped me primarily by reading. We had always had books in the house, always had magazines. For my father, the life of literature was wonderful. He, because of the way high schools bought books, you tended to teach the same book as long as they had 40 copies year after year after year. And he taught every year Idylls of the King by Tennyson. He taught Macbeth. He taught The House of Seven Gables by Hawthorne, and he was in love with those books, and he did not get bored or tired year after year in teaching them. Did
you have any teachers as a young person that really influenced you? Talking now about high school, not later.
Yeah. I can't say in high school. There were teachers whom I thought were very good and whom I liked, but I wasn't a reader yet in high school. I was too interested in, the things young adolescent kids do, but reading wasn't one of them. I really didn't start to read in a serious way in a loving way until I got to college.
And talk a little about your mother and her input into the shaping of your character.
Well, my mother, I think, had a profound input. She was the daughter of immigrants. She grew up in New York. She never had the opportunity, as women usually didn't in those days, to go to college. But she was profoundly ambitious for me. There was nothing, too high for me to aim at. I think it was her ambition, and my father's kind of love of literature and things intellectual that kind of merged to fuel where my energies were put.
And what about conversations at the dinner table? Was there a lot of the discussions that go with Jewish idealism, concerns about social justice?
No, there wasn't. I mean, we were not a heavily observant Jewish family. My mother, indeed, would not be observant at all. Her parents, I suspect, were socialists who'd come over from Europe. Religion to her was indeed probably the opiate of the masses, if she could know that term. My father cared, and I was, of course, bar mitzvah, and we went to shul on the high holidays and the like. But I really wasn't aware until I would say just in the last 10 years, of what a profound effect it had on me to be the only Jewish kid in my class from K to 8, and one of the 2 or 3 in a class of 300 in high school. I mean, it's only in recent years that I've looked back and seen how important being Jewish was, how much of an outsider I felt, although at the time I did not.
And you, in one of your essays, you actually talk about Justices Frankfurter and Brandeis and the consequences of their Jewishness for the way they viewed the world and their concerns, actually. And this outsider theme emerges in that.
Well, that's right. The theme of that essay, in a sense, is that some Jews have wanted to be insiders and some Jews have preferred to remain outsiders. And I don't know that I had any conscious preference, but I was probably an outsider until, I would say, 10 years ago. And it's in the last 10 years that I have become, in my own mind, very identified with Jewish causes. I'm now very active in the American Jewish Committee, and I'm on the board of Brandeis. I care now deeply about Jewish causes, but I did not until I was probably into my mid-50s.
Do you think you've been influenced by the focus on cultural identity that is so much a part of American pluralism today?
No, I think it's been, I think, 2 things. It's, first of all, I've discovered the joy and beauty of Judaism and the threat that it is under in a country in the United States, not principally from anti-Semitism, but from intermarriage. That, the values of the Jewish community and of Jewish religion seem to me very important, and I think, we risk not being able to perpetuate them if we don't identify as Jews. I think the other thing is that I really went through my life without ever facing anti-Semitism, and it's only in the last 10 years that I've come to appreciate how much my parents' generation did suffer from that, and I've come to be much more conscious of that.
Let's go back a minute, because you touched on this, but as I look at your life and your writings, it's really a story, as you said, of understanding how to educate yourself, how to create a community of education, and how to secure an environment in which students will be prepared for life. And so let's talk a little about this love affair that you have with books, which I think is a phase in that. You are a collector. Tell us a little about books and what they have meant for you beyond just reading them.
Well, there are of course single books, individual books that all of us find at some point in our life, and we read once every 2 or 3 years for the rest of our life. And I have a half a dozen of such books. But I have loved collecting books, and I don't know, how that relates to being, as some people are, a collector of stamps or of antique cars or of pressed flowers or what. But I have loved collecting books, and I, have an elaborate scheme of organization and codification, and have something now on the order of 6,000 books.
Oh my goodness.
Although every 2, 3, 4 years I get to sell 1,000 of them because I just don't have room. And it's like giving up a child, but I just don't have room. And your interests change, and books that interested you 30 years ago, interest you less today.
What writers stand out in your mind? I mean, there must be an enormous number for someone like you, but sort of key books, pivotal books.
Well, key books, I would say Camus is one, and The Plague would be the pivotal book. Faulkner is, of course, one, and gosh, anything of Faulkner is wonderful. I love the short stories of Faulkner. I love Hawthorne, and I love the Blythedale Romance even more than I love Scarlet Letter. Both wonderful books. I very much like V.S. Naipaul, and I think his books are just brilliant books. But there are many, the authors could go on.
And what you say, you write in your book, books earn their claim on our lives by their power to help us to think, to care, and to acquire standards of judgment and appreciation. So they really, it's a program of continuous education, really.
Well, I think it is, and the phrase "books claim," make their claim because on their power. All of us have read books that we never quite forget. I mean, I saw a reference a day or two ago in someplace in the papers to Mice and Men, the Steinbeck book, and Lenny in there. After you've read that book, you never again can be quite as callous as perhaps you once were to people who are perhaps a bit retarded, perhaps a bit slow, but are kindly and nice people. It affects you. It affects everything you look at after that.
And it's not, it is partly the story, the idea that moves you, but it's also the use of words, the use of language.
Oh, sure it is. I mean, there's not a parent, I think, who, if you read King Lear in your adulthood, doesn't ask himself lots and lots of questions of how did Lear go wrong with his daughters. And gosh, the lines from Lear that come out, you know, how sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child. I mean, the language is not beatable. As an undergraduate, I had 2 courses with Northrop Frye, the great scholar of so much of literature, and he used to say that, you know, an economy of words and expressing a thought is one of the great achievements. And of course, the quintessential example is to be or not to be. You probably can't express that idea better than in that brief collection of words.
And you are a craftsman with the word, as I read your essays, and do you think that that comes from, to use the metaphor you used yesterday, the passing of the jade, that you have acquired a skill with writing by reading so much?
I don't know if it's that as much as it was going to law school. I think law school makes you aware of words. There was a famous episode, I'm not sure that it's in the book, when Abe Fortas was being nominated for the Supreme Court, and he was asked a question in the Judiciary Committee about a phrase like due process of law, and he couldn't answer it, or he wouldn't answer it, or he didn't believe it wise to answer it. And the senators kept pressing him. Look, it's only a few words, I mean, after all. and Fortas replied and said, "Sir, I have made my living with words, and I can tell you every single word, you know, is tricky, and it's a well of meaning, and you've got to be very careful." So I think law school really made me conscious of how to use words, and it made me aware that you need 10 drafts of anything you write, and it does get better. You put the adjectives in and then you take them out.
So what is the most important thing a student must know about writing? That is the patience, the perseverance, the need for rewrite?
All of those, but I think most of all, the right word. I mean, I again and again am puzzled in my own writing by how to find the right adjective. You know, did someone say something sharply or bitterly or quickly or glibly? I mean, to find the right adverb, I find, you know, enormously challenging and difficult.
You went to Harvard, and then to Yale Law School. And I was struck in reading your autobiographical essay about something changed in you that made you more comfortable with being a student. What was that?
I've tried myself to figure that out. I certainly at Harvard did well enough, but was not exceptional. A good part of the Harvard years were years of kind of post-adolescent depression and lack of certainty and groping around for what life might offer. I then worked for 2 years after college, and by the time I went back to law school, I think I was more mature, and there was something about law school that was just, to me, dazzling. I just loved those professors. I didn't want to leave after 3 years. It was just a wonderful experience.
And you were a journalist in between.
I was a journalist in between.
So, and
that's right.
You suggested that contributed also to your.
It may well have.
Yeah.
It certainly put me in closer touch with public affairs and made me. You know, we're talking now at a local level, city council, police court, things of that sort. But all of that made me think it would be a good thing to be a lawyer.
Now, at Yale, you encountered and studied under one of the 2 mentors in your life, Alexander Bickel, who was a professor of law. Tell us his impact on you and the educational journey.
Well, Alex Bickle had an enormous impact on me. He is a man who was born in Bucharest, came to this country at age 12, became a brilliant student, himself clerked for Justice Frankfurter. He was just in the classroom electric. Alex Bickle had a mind of enormous originality. He encouraged students to engage him and debate him. He was enormously generous. He helped me, when I wanted to enter law teaching. Alex Bickle was just kind of the most important teacher I ever had.
And he taught you procedure, right? Was that,
or
many things?
Constitutional law.
Oh, constitutional law,
He was
okay.
a constitutional law person,
Okay.
but he had views on constitutional law which were quite out of the received conventional wisdom at the time, and today I think, and sadly, are hardly regarded at all. I regard them highly, but the history is in a sense passed by his views. Maybe they'll come back someday.
And what were those views? I mean,
well, he is very much a person of judicial restraint.
I see.
Very much a person of keeping the Supreme Court out of federal courts generally, out of decisions that ought to be made by legislative and elected officials.
Mm-hmm.
And of
so
course,
he would have been much exasperated by the recent election in Florida.
well, I think so.
But,
yes, I think so.
And he taught you, you say, the morality of consent. And the procedures by which public decisions are made.
Yes. I mean, part of what Bickle understood was that society had to develop organically. One of his great heroes was Edmund Burke. Mm-hmm. And he admired Burke's sense of society as a kind of a coral reef of beliefs and views that had been accumulated over many, many centuries. And he really wanted society, he wanted the Supreme Court to play a role that generated widespread consent rather than just by edict announce this is what the law will be, because he thought that didn't have a chance of catching on. Mm-hmm. That one really needed to generate in society a general consent. And indeed, that's what he thought. I'm not sure whether he thought Brown against the Board, which declared segregation unconstitutional, was a wise decision in a scholarly sense, but he was very pleased with the court saying, we will do this not immediately, but with all deliberate speed, to be done slowly, carefully, building up kind of a basis in society for acceptance of it.
And the man who argued that case, Brown versus Board of Education, was Thurgood Marshall, who you law clerked under.
That's
actually,
right.
Later when he was appointed to the appellate court and then...
That's right. Indeed, Alex Bickle told me once, he was a law clerk for Justice Frankfurter when that case was argued, mm-hmm. and he said that Justice Marshall's argument was the finest Supreme Court argument he had ever heard. Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little about Thurgood Marshall.
Well, there's a remarkable man. I think one of the great Americans, and I think I say in the book, I think that he has done more for race relations in this country than perhaps any individual except for Abraham Lincoln. That may be a bit of an overstatement, but he should be near the top. He's a remarkable man. He was so different from my law school professors, who were, of course, very scholarly and intellectual. Mm-hmm. He, when I went to work for him right out of law school, was a practical man. Mm-hmm. He wanted to know how trials worked. And when errors were made, allegedly, in lower courts, I mean, he was looking at trial tactics. He was looking at why they occurred. He was much more a pragmatic man than most law professors were. And that added a very nice dimension to my own growth.
And he really carried the load of all of the civil rights cases that went through the courts leading up to Brown versus Board of Education, which he also argued.
He did indeed, and indeed not only carried the load, as you indicate, carried it both intellectually and physically. Mm-hmm. The story of his life is a story of riding in jalopies all across the South without air conditioning, unable to stay in hotels, unable to use facilities and gas stations. I mean, a really tough, hard existence. And more than that, he carried the load in the theory of how to go to Brown against the Board. Many people in the civil rights movement disagreed with him. They mm-hmm. thought he would lose that case, and if he lost it, things would be set back for another 50 years. That it was wiser to go prove that separate facilities weren't equal, one by one, rather than try to get them all declared unconstitutional.
So he, in a way, had what you call, quoting Emerson, a heroic mind.
He clearly did. I mean, he was a person, he had a sense of destiny, and you could just, occasionally you meet those in your friends, you occasionally see it in students. I mean, he knew from some very young age that he was destined to do important things. I mean, he felt it, he believed it, he wanted it, and he did have a heroic mind. And I mean, it's interesting to me that once Brown against the Board was decided, he had really achieved his destiny, and that's when he began to think of other things, and of course finally became a judge.
Mm-hmm. In the Brown versus Board of Education, we should note he used Gunnar Myrdal's book on the American Dilemma, and that text had a key draftsman of that was Ralph Bunche,
That's right.
who was another distinguished black American who, so both in their own ways, worked to bring down the barriers of segregation.
Well, that's right. Ralph Bunche had a very difficult career because he was black. He was, I believe, the first black person appointed a professor at Harvard, but only served a year or two and then went back to activities outside the academy. But that's exactly right. Kenneth Clark was another one. And of course, Kenneth Clark's experiments with asking black children to choose between white dolls and black dolls was also cited by the court, along with Gunnar Myrdal, as support for the decision.
In talking about one of your essays comparing Martin Luther King, Eudora Welty, Hugo Black, you're trying to find the features that exist in all of their lives, and you conclude by saying they teach us the importance of achieving a grip on our identity and a sense of our own calling. And so let's take that as a platform to move into your focus on educating students, giving them a liberal arts education. What do you think that these heroes and that kind of education can teach us about our own lives and how we should lead them?
Well, what I think a liberal education at its best can do is make us say, you live but once. Everyone has unusual abilities, unique abilities, and part of the satisfactions of life come from deploying those abilities in the name of a great cause. Martin Luther King is a good example. I think when he was 26 years old in Montgomery, he had no idea that he would find that history would present him with the opportunities it did. But the point is, he seized the opportunities. He saw that it was his destiny because of his talents, because he was a stranger to the South at that moment, not to the South, to Montgomery, that he could do something. I think the same is true with Justice Black, who was a conventional plaintiff's lawyer and got into the Senate and suddenly became wedded to a series of social ideals about public policy. And of course, on the Supreme Court, when Justice Black got to the Supreme Court, all of his law clerks report that the first day, when they reported for work, he handed them a copy of Tacitus and said, take the first week and read this, because all of the evils that Tacitus describes in the Roman Empire, of what power does to corrupt, of how government seeks to impose improperly on people, those are all in Tacitus, and they're all what we're talking about today. He informed himself with a larger view of human nature and human conduct.
And what about Eudora Welty, who also is in that trial?
What I like about Eudora Welty is that there's a woman who still lives in the house in which she grew up, who rarely leaves Jackson, Mississippi. You may know the essays that were published as One Writer's Beginning that she delivered at Harvard. And the last sentence, I believe, of that volume says something on the order, a sheltered life can also be a daring one. And she lived a sheltered, quiet life, never married, but she made the most of it. She came to look at people and look deeply into people and learn how to describe people, and of course became an exquisite story writer. In talking about a liberal arts education, say the value of a liberal education is on how it is made to shape, refine, and deepen our sense of self and others. You also talk about building our private sense of self, but relating that
to the building of a public self. Talk a little about that. What is the dynamic between those two, and what is the requirement in building each of those things?
Well, you know, the public self that we all show to the world is obviously important, and engagement in public life, engagement in one's profession, and all those things are obviously important. But what I hope a liberal education does is to make you ask questions about yourself. What is it that makes me happy? What makes me a good person? What would make me a better person? Why is it so difficult to come to grips with unhappiness and sadness? Why is life so unfair to some people? Those are the questions, you know, that a liberal education, that great literature, great essays do help you ask yourself. And I think they make you a wiser person because of that.
Mm-hmm. And what about the public side? I mean, building that commitment. Is it through the study of individuals like Thurgood Marshall, or what?
I think that's one way. I think there are probably others as well. I mean, I've been struck living in small towns for much of my adulthood, Iowa City, Iowa, Hanover, New Hampshire, at the extent to which communities depend upon participation. If people don't run for the school board or for selectmen, if people don't participate in PTAs, if people don't write letters to their legislators, things suffer. It's important that people have a public side to their life, and that they do try to participate in events that shape us, in a communal sense.
When you were president of the University of Iowa, you also taught a course on conscience and public.
I did. It was a course that a colleague and I taught together that was called Individuals and Institutions. And we tried to read books and essays about what happens when individuals come in conflict with institutions. We read some of the Greek tragedies. We read Burke. We read de Tocqueville. We read some Erickson. But life is really about what happens when one's conscience is up against, demands that from the public sector that you behave differently.
So what in the end will empower students to develop these virtues in the 4 years that they're an undergraduate? Is it the kind of courses that they have, the way that they're taught, or is it also the people they meet in their own community of students?
I think all of the above. Certainly who your fellow students are is as important as anything, and who your teachers are is important. But I think reading is too. My wife and I a few weeks ago saw Hedda Gabler. We've seen about a half a dozen Ibsen plays in the last 5 years. Those are all kind of simplistic fights, or the enemy of the people, between a doctor who knows the water is unsafe and a community that doesn't want to announce it. You have to decide, what do you do as a person of conscience? And it's not easy. And if you become too rigid, you just become kind of uselessly moralistic. But if you become too lax, you may lose a sense of who you are as a person. I think literature helps students think about those questions. It doesn't give them the answer, but it helps them think.
And partly what you're trying to accomplish in this laboratory of the undergraduate education is making students understand that knowing that you don't know is important.
Oh boy, absolutely, yes. I think any of us who have taught certainly know that there comes a moment when a student asks something and you don't know. And I was told by a senior colleague my first year of teaching, you had better say, I don't know, but I'll find out. Because if you try to fake it, they're going to catch you. They're going to see that you're trying to do it. But that's right, we know so little. We know so little.
Now, this focus on the liberal arts as a leader, you actually say somewhere that you were mentored by Martin Meyerson, Elliot Steller, and Vartan Gregorian, who were all at Penn with you. And you go on to say, I came to realize that the true importance of holding a senior administrative position was the power to enunciate the Academy's central values and the responsibility to set forth the university's agenda. And that is really what you've tried to do in these
It's what I've tried to do, because my own sense is that a president is really the only person in the institution who has an opportunity to set the agenda for debate within the faculty and the student body. He may not always prevail, but he has the opportunity, or she, to put items on the agenda and ask that they be debated. And of course, being a president is a rare privilege in terms of access to the op-ed pages and to television shows and to things of that sort. So that I've thought it was always very important for presidents to use that opportunity to state those views that they think are important.
Now, in doing that, there are two issues. One is communication, which you actually talk about in one of your essays, and I'm curious about that. That is the frustration of having a vision, being a craftsman enough to articulate with your own words what that vision is, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, being a leader of a bureaucracy where, you know, an official statement has to be filtered through that bureaucracy. Tell us about those that tension and how you reconcile that.
You know, every president understands that when he speaks publicly, his words are circulated to alumni, faculty, students, the local community, and that some of those words are going to alienate. And a president has a responsibility to be cautious because you don't want to alienate people on whom your institution greatly depends. And so I think all of us feel frustrated on some issues because on balance, we conclude that it will alienate more people than you would like to alienate. I think they will accept you when you speak on educational issues, although I think affirmative action is an example that when presidents do speak on that, they sometimes do alienate large sections of their alumni. But I think one has to use the privilege of that pulpit carefully, prudently. Because I think you do run the risk of alienating people. And I think all of us have had experience with donors who call up and say, you know, that speech did it for me, goodbye. That happens.
So in a way, as a president, there is an interesting play between the sense from your own personal life of the vision that you would like to realize, but then the political realities of a university.
That's right. There is indeed. You mentioned Martin Meyerson, who was president of the University of Pennsylvania as I was a young man moving up the academic ladder. One of the things I admired about President Meyerson is that in his early years as president of Penn, he essentially said, you know, you here glow in the fact that you're the best university in Philadelphia, and you glow in the fact that you're a member of the Ivy League, but until the day comes when your PhDs are as valued and sought after by the Harvard and Yale faculties as their PhDs are by ours, we've got ground to cover. I mean, he essentially came and said, this place is a little too self-satisfied, a little too smug. We need to be better. And that had an electric effect. People were a little upset, but it had the proper impact, the intended impact.
When you came to Dartmouth, one of the part of the challenge for you, I think, because Dartmouth, I believe, had some difficulties before, was to realize this liberal vision. And you actually said in your inaugural address, we must strengthen our attraction for those singular students whose greatest pleasure may come not from the camaraderie of classmates, but from the lonely acts of writing poetry or mastering the cello or solving mathematical riddles or translating catalysts. That was a heroic statement at that time,
well,
wasn't it?
I'll tell you, you know, the cello became my symbol among the students, and Catullus became an author whose whose name they knew.
I see.
But I was concerned, when I looked at Dartmouth, of course, seriously before I accepted the job, and what I was concerned with was, I thought, a sense that there was too much emphasis on well-rounded students. The whole place had to be well-rounded. And I wanted us to have some students who were more, as I said, you can be so well-rounded that you have no point at all. Some students who had a point, who had a focus, who had achieved a lot and meant to achieve a lot. And so a part of my mission there was to see if we couldn't strengthen the student body in those ways, and I hope we did.
Give me a specific example of a program, either at Iowa or at Dartmouth, where you think this liberal arts vision that you brought to the table mattered in actually implementing a program.
Well, for example, we started at Dartmouth a Presidential Scholars Program where a student who had a certain grade point average could work 10 hours a week for a faculty member as a colleague. You could help do research, you could edit manuscripts, you could work in the laboratory. You couldn't do gopher work. You couldn't do Xeroxing. That wasn't fair to the students, or getting coffee. But we tried to set up collaboration, and the consequence of that was that every year 2 or 3 papers would be published with a faculty member's name, maybe some graduate students, and finally the undergraduate student. But we very much wanted undergraduates to be able to get a feel for what it was to work with a faculty member and to kind of be at the frontiers of research. And I think that mattered. There was a lot of student criticism at the first. It was elitist, and it was special opportunities. We've now reached the point where it's now listed along with the academic honors in the commencement program, and presidential scholars, are listed as a category of achievers. So I've been very pleased at that.
Now, you were at both Iowa, a great public university, and you were at Dartmouth, a great private. What is the difference? Or are there differences in the challenges that you face leading?
Well, there's superficial differences, which I think are not at the center of what are the differences. The superficial ones are that Iowa was 30,000 students, Dartmouth's a little better than 5,000. Iowa was public and one dealt with a legislature. Dartmouth is private, governed by a board of trustees. For me, the biggest difference was that the value added to a student's life at Iowa was greater than at Dartmouth because the distance was greater. Students came to that university from small towns in Iowa, never had left the state, never been to Chicago, never seen a play, never been to a symphony, maybe never seen a bookstore in their hometowns. And they came and they started to read Plato and Aristotle and all of those things, and they were set afire. And they grew and grew and grew. Dartmouth students were, from more affluent homes. They'd had more higher quality educational opportunities. They came in at a much higher point of sophistication. And of course, they grew too. But I was really struck by the role of the University of Iowa in just opening up the lives of kids who'd not had that experience before.
Was it in this public-private distinction compare dealing with legislators for state budgets with dealing with trustees and donors? Is there a difference in those two sets of tasks?
There certainly was not a difference in dealing with donors. There are people who, love their universities and are philanthropic and want to give and want to be helpful. Dealing with legislators is different because I just sensed the distance between me and them was very great. I was not of their type. These are legislators who were elected by the people of Iowa, and I was a very different Eastern-bred type of person. It's quite different with the Board of Trustees at Dartmouth, who share similar backgrounds, and you much more readily belong to that kind of group. So it was a different experience at Iowa.
So what if you were writing a job description for the title University Presidents? What are the educational requirements aside? What does it take to undertake the task of leading great either public or private institutions of higher education?
Well, I think it takes an appetite to want to govern the institution. And by that I mean to channel your own energies and ultimately professional fulfillment through the institution. You no longer channel your energies through becoming a fixture on the lecture circuit or a writer of lots of books or an attender of conferences. Your glory, you ought to be a person who wants your glory to come through the strengthening of the institution, so that at the end of a period of 5 or 10 or 15 years, people will say, this is a better place because he or she was president. I do think you have to be a person interested in ideas. For myself, I think that by and large, you need to be a person who's a scholar. I don't think you can lead the faculty if you're not, haven't yourself been a scholar and had the experience of teaching and creating knowledge. There are notable exceptions to that, but I think as a general rule, that's very important. I think, too, you somehow have to exemplify something of a selflessness, of a devotion to the place, because you're asking other people, all those people you work with, all the vice presidents and deans, to be devoted to the place. And if you show less than full devotion, or if you show cynicism or in that, it's much harder to motivate those people to share your commitment to making this a stronger place.
One of the problems that all universities confronted, during these periods were the question of excellence and equality. Not necessarily saying they're in conflict, but in other words, to ensuring greater equality, ensuring greater diversity, raise questions about the procedures by which people would be admitted. Tell us a little about your thoughts on that set of problems and how well universities in general have weathered that process.
Well, I think the process of opening up universities so there is greater access and for a greater range of students has been a very successful one. You look at most universities, and I think that affirmative action has clearly worked. It has given us more interesting student bodies. It's given us minority graduates who will now take a place in the professions. I mean, when I look at what this country is becoming, and think of the possibility that without affirmative action, we would not be graduating people of minority background who would become the leaders of this new country in the professions and in education and in medicine and in business. I fear to think what the country would have been like otherwise. I mean, I think affirmative action has been indispensable, and I think all of us find that one of the ways that incoming students, high school seniors, judge the places they're looking at is the degree of diversity that it has. Students don't want to go to schools that don't have sufficient diversity. They recognize that they're inherently more interesting places.
And you actually say in your discussion of what a liberal arts education should be, that the contribution that is actually being made by being exposed to different communities, being exposed to different people from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's interesting that for certainly for a generation from World War II onward, universities understood that geographic diversity was important, and they went out of their way to try to enroll students from wider and wider sections of the United States, so that the notion that you learn in better circumstances with students who've had diverse upbringings is not one that started with the Civil Rights Movement. It's one that goes back much earlier than that.
Let's talk a little about where universities are going in general, and one thing that strikes me, I think it's fair to ask you, is your commitment and your powerful statement of the importance of a liberal arts education, a losing battle, in the face of the specialization of the academic disciplines, the emphasis in our society generally about the importance and priority that should be given to the market, and other factors.
I don't know whether it's a losing battle. It's easy to look around and conclude that it may be, that pre-vocational education and college, kind of professional education at the college level is growing and growing, and many, many parents want that. But if people don't speak up for the importance of liberal education, we'll never know if it might not be a losing battle. We've certainly seen in the national political scene that ideas that seemed like a losing battle during the New Deal or the Great Society, whatever, suddenly their time seems to come. And so my great hope is that enough of us will keep alive the focus on liberal education that the day may well come when it's much more widely accepted.
And what would a successful result be? A kind of core curriculum that exposed students to more than what we used to call Western Civ, but rather the multiple civilizations that important to an understanding of world culture?
I think ultimately a successful result would be one that moved professional education to the graduate level, so that undergraduate education could be a liberal education, and one could then take business, one would then go to a graduate school of business or a graduate school of nursing or a graduate school of accounting or journalism, but that the undergraduate years would be given over to a liberal education.
Is there a way that parents and students who agree with what you're saying, is there a report card that they should give to the university that they're looking at? Is there a check-off list? Is there a way of getting a handle on what a school would look like that embodies the vision that you're talking about?
I think it would look like many, many universities and colleges that exist today. It would provide full opportunities to major in English or chemistry or psychology or biology or Portuguese literature or whatever. But I think parents, are so concerned that their children have the tools for success in this society, that in a sense they constrict the kinds of things students are willing to look at. I had a young woman in my office at Dartmouth one year whose parents wanted her to major in economics because they thought that had great professional utility. And she had indeed fallen in love with Portuguese literature. She just loved it. And they could not understand, what was the attraction of that and why you would ever want to do that instead of economics. And it's in many ways, the parents that we have to talk to.
And this, by the way, harkens back to these themes in your background. That is the themes of ambition and a kind of a well-developed liberal vision of the world. So in a way, I guess one lesson I'm drawing from this conversation is that part of the goal of education is to empower students to carefully and thoughtfully make those kind of choices for themselves.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, people really sometimes don't remember that the college years, you are still very young. You are still in a sense a post-adolescent. You're trying to figure out who you are. You are confused about what career path to take. You don't really fully know how to estimate your own abilities. You're influenced by peers. It's a very confusing time of life for students, and I think it's important to expose them to all these kinds of opportunities that a liberal education does as they form more fully and more conclusively who it is they want to be.
Now, in our environment today, the implications of the technology that it's available, and you actually beautifully stated the problem yesterday in your lecture, that is the capacity of technology not to leave us alone, the way that we can be interrupted in those moments of silence, reflection, reading, and so on. So this leads me to ask for your comments on how we will navigate the future, carrying in ourselves this vision, which is both powerful and beautifully stated about a liberal arts way of dealing with life in the world, versus the power, the attraction, the seduction of all of these new technologies?
Well, the new technologies are, of course, incredibly seductive and attractive, as you say. And I think right now we're obviously in the first generation of living with these technologies. That means that people are just forever made frantic by them. People carry beepers and cell phones. The minute they get home or to the office, they get on the email to see what's listed there. Then they get on the answering machine to see what's listed there. On the other hand, they bring you CDs and DVDs and all kinds of wonderful things. I hope we're going to figure out finally that we don't want a lifestyle driven by these things. I think, for example, with television, adolescence aside, that more and more adults have figured out over 2 generations that you watch television selectively. You watch it for the things that you truly want, but it's not a narcotic for you. And I hope we're going to reach that age with a lot of this new technology, that we don't allow it to follow us on vacation and follow us into our home at night and forever pursue us, but give us some time to ourselves.
You speak of liberal arts and a liberal arts education as really a tool for life, in a way. That might not be the best metaphor,
yes,
but a way to prepare yourself all through your life to deal, with the ups and downs of life. Now, I know that when you were president of Dartmouth, you were stricken with cancer, and you were public about that. And you've written and said often that your liberal arts training helped you deal with the difficulties, of confronting that situation. Tell us a little about that, how, in this particular instance, it really mattered, what you preach, so to speak.
Well, in 1994, I was stricken with cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It, of course, I was told there was a good chance of dealing with it successfully with chemotherapy, but it was probably a 50-50 chance. Fortunately, it worked. But that begins to make you think that life is short, that you're not invincible. And then you begin to ask, what matters to me? Am I using my time properly? Why am I letting other people control so much of my time? It makes you think about your children, who, after all, are your most important legacy on earth. And it kind of makes you ask, have I completed my task with them of passing on the values I want and them to hope but have, and to being an example for them? Have I become the kind of father I want to be? Those things really make you ask questions of that kind. And I think the asking of the questions begins to help you to try to answer them. I, like everyone who is stricken with cancer, began by saying, why me? I mean, I'm a perfectly nice person. Why me? And of course, you begin to realize everybody says that. And a friend of mine, who happens to be a minister, a congregational minister, said to me, why not you? Somebody has to be stricken with cancer, why not you? And I began to think about that, But that's the whole question of the arbitrariness of the universe. It's the question of Job, of why does God treat people, some people, in certain ways. And I've had cancer twice since then. I'm dealing with it still now. And it makes me think about it very, very seriously, of particularly how best to be myself if time is limited. Whether it is, I don't know. But, a third time makes you think that it could be. It makes you see you don't want to spend your time on trivial things, and you don't want to spend your time on things that are mere duty. If you've chosen them, and you can retreat from them, you want to spend it on those things that really matter to you.
And did you turn to your books a lot? When that is reading, was reading, you found something even more useful?
I found helpful. One of the first books I read is one of these books that I mentioned earlier that I read every 2 or 3 years, because you can read it in a long, long day. And that's The Plague by Camus, which of course is about why does this plague, this pestilence strike this city of Oran in Algeria? And of course nobody can answer that question, but they puzzle with it. And that's of course what you puzzle with cancer. And you really ask yourself, during that, I may have 6 months left. I may have a year left. What should I do with that time? Why has this happened to me? And, it's, people say to you, glib things that are well-meaning. Like, you've really had a rich life. You know, your work is done in a way. I mean, you're so fortunate. You didn't have they say, you didn't have a life where you failed at your career or raised terrible kids or had a bad marriage. You know, your life is, in a sense, a nice complete package, but nobody sees it about themselves that way.
One final question, sort of looking back at this journey that you've been on, students watching it, is there one particular lesson that you think that they might draw from this intellectual journey that you've taken?
Well, you know, a lesson I really draw is one that my father always taught me, which is about the importance of late bloomers. My father had students in junior year in high school, who were C students, and 30 years later, they were the mayor of Manchester, New Hampshire, and they were college professors, and they were physicians and lawyers. We all mature at different rates, and I think one of the things a liberal education does is to make you ready for the moment, make the ground ready for the moment when the seed is prepared to drop. I think students too often think if they're not a success in college, they're a failure forever, or if they're not a success in a professional school. And I think we all grow at different rates. And the late bloomers are legion, starting with Winston Churchill, and you can go through lists and lists and lists. Harry Truman, one grows. And I hope students kind of understand they're preparing themselves, even if they're not quite sure now where they're going.
President Freedman, on that very positive note, thank you very much for being with us today and telling us this extraordinary journey that you've been on, both intellectually and as a leader of great public institutions.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.